Joining us now, MS Now Justice and Intelligence reporter Ken Dilanian, Ashley Parker, staff writer for The Atlantic and an MS Now political analyst, and Barbara McQuade, former U.S. attorney in Michigan, MS Now legal analyst and author of the new book, The Fix, Saving America from the Corruption of Mob-Style Government. Ken, what more do we know about what's in this plea deal and what happens next in this case?
Well, there is a change of plea on the docket right now, and we understand that John Bolton will plead guilty to this single count of retaining classified information on June 26th at the end of the month. And then he will face a judge later in sentencing. And the terms of this deal, it's a pretty broad array of possibilities here, from 0 to 60 months in prison. So 0 to 5 years in prison. The deal also calls for a $2.25 million fine. So a significant penalty here for one count of retaining classified information, as we understand it, as part of a personal diary entry that was used to prepare for his memoir and was seen by his wife and daughter. So no allegation that he leaked to the media, no allegation that he transmitted classified information to a foreign adversary, although those allegations were in the original indictment. He was charged with transmitting. He's pleading guilty to retaining. And what we should also point out is that the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, Jim Himes, is telling us that this was a very serious matter, that this was a bad breach of classified information. He's not going into details, but he's been briefed on this. And so while many people have viewed this case as an example of weaponization, and it may well be in some aspects, it's also clear that there was some substance to the allegations. John Bolton has decided to plead guilty to forego the possibility of decades in prison and millions of dollars in legal fees, but he does face the possibility of some time in prison and a very hefty $2.25 million fine. Ariel. Yeah,
I definitely want to get to those distinctions between this case and the cases that have faced other political adversaries of President Trump. But Barb, the question on a lot of people's minds now is Bolton is now facing up to 60 months in prison, as Ken was mentioning. Do you think he's going to get that? Is he going to serve time?
I doubt he'll get the full 60 months, 5 years. That is a cap. So oftentimes parties sort of agree to disagree as to what the ultimate sentence will be and leave it up to the judge, as it appears to be in this case. But they've agreed it won't exceed 60 months, and the judge won't be able to do that. I think there are many mitigating factors here. John Bolton has served his country honorably. He did not share this information with hostile foreign adversaries. But there is an arrogance in sharing classified information with one's family members. They don't have clearances. And although I'm sure he trusted them, one of the allegations in this indictment that was disturbing is why you can't share it even with people you love and trust. And that is that his emails were hacked by Iran, which then shared them and had access to them. So it demonstrates the harm when someone acts very recklessly with classified information. So I'm sure he will argue to the judge why a lower sentence is more appropriate, but he's also going to face this $2.25 million fine, which is a significant penalty.
It sure is, and I'm glad you brought up that sort of circuitous way that this was all unearthed. Barb, what does it say to you that Bolton only pleaded guilty to one of 18 counts that he was facing?
Not unusual. Oftentimes when parties want to resolve a case, and in classified information cases, the government has a strong incentive to resolve the case because to show its evidence also risks disclosing more classified information. And so it's not uncommon to resolve a case by pleading guilty to, say, only one count. But importantly, the sentencing guidelines say that the court is permitted to consider all of the relevant conduct when fashioning a sentence. So even though it's capped at 5 years, the judge is going to look at all of this conduct, including the Iranian hack, when it's deciding what's the appropriate sentence in this case.
And Ashley, you heard Ken say there is a distinction between this case and others that we've seen generated from the DOJ against Trump's political foes. But is this a victory for President Trump, or at least is he going to tout it as such as he goes after his political adversaries?
I would absolutely expect him to tout it as such, in part because a lot of the other cases he and his Department of Justice have brought against his political enemies have not been particularly successful, have been thrown out by judges or even by, in at least one case, grand juries, and have felt a lot like amateur hour. And this is a case where I believe the investigation started under the Biden administration. This is a case, again, where you have someone who should have known better. John Bolton absolutely understood that sharing notes of what he saw in the Situation Room or what a national security advisor told him over unsecure email with family members, even family members he trusted, would have been a breach. John Bolton is not someone, who could plausibly argue that they were naive to the rules of government and national security. And this is one where it looks like John Bolton is about to accept a plea deal, which means he is admitting some guilt. And so this is, from the president's point of view, a far better, more vindicating outcome than some of these other cases, which have not gone anywhere.
And Barb, as we've been discussing, the genesis of this case was Bolton's 2020 book about the president that was called The Room Where It Happened. In that book, he uses phrases like the intel briefer said, and while in the Situation Room, I learned. Is this what distinguishes this case from other national security officials who have also written books about their time in their capacities?
Yes, there's a process when somebody wants to write a book who's had one of these sensitive positions, and that is you have to go through a pre-publication review. I think John Bolton even did that, and yet he still included some of these kinds of things. Even if the book didn't disclose classified information, the fact that he shared it with his wife and his daughter alone, sent it on an unsecure email, that is what was criminal about this case. And of course, seeing the risk when that got intercepted. And so, it's perhaps less egregious than when someone shares it with a reporter. As we saw, remember Reality Winner had done that. She got 60 months for sharing classified information. She was an NSA contractor, sharing things with the media. But disclosing this, being so reckless and careless in the way he handled it, I think is what made the difference in this case.
And as you mentioned, he's an official who theoretically should have known better. Ken, the resolution of Bolton's case appears kind of similar to what we saw happen with former CIA director and retired General David Petraeus. But Petraeus only pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor, and Bolton's pleading guilty to a felony here.
Yes, and I think Barb put her finger on the distinction between these two very similar cases. David Petraeus was gathering material for a book, and he put highly sensitive, highly classified material in these sort of notebooks, which he then turned over to his ghostwriter, his co-author, a woman with whom he happened to be having an affair. And he got caught, and he pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor. The difference is, though, that John Bolton's emails allegedly were hacked by the Iranians. And that's how the United States learned about the fact that this highly sensitive information was in Bolton's possession, because they got some highly sensitive collection from the Iranian government, according to the allegations in the indictment and other reporting we've done. And so the damage here is what is the difference between those two cases. There was no allegation or information that I'm aware of in the Petraeus case that any of that information got in the wrong hands. In this case, it did, even though John Bolton didn't intend for that to happen. His alleged recklessness and negligence caused that to happen, and that may explain the difference here between a misdemeanor and a felony in these cases.
Ashley, do you expect that getting this guilty plea against Bolton will embolden Trump's DOJ to go after other political enemies?
It's a good question. On the one hand, this will be a victory that he can tout, that we would expect him to tout on Truth Social and elsewhere. But we've also seen that often when this president gets a victory in any realm, that does not suffice, and it does, in fact, embolden him. We've seen that on foreign policy. There were people in his administration who told me that had the raid on Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela not gone so well, that they don't think that we would be in the situation we are with Iran right now. So, looking back at history and how this president has behaved previously, I would say he is likely to be emboldened, but that doesn't mean that these other cases, if they are grounded in less compelling facts and evidence, will go the way that this one against John Bolton did.
Barb, I want to circle back to something that you mentioned when it comes to vetting a book from someone in the national security realm. Should there be more checks and balances before these officials are allowed to publish information about their time serving the president?
I think there's already sufficient review process. In fact, if anything, sometimes people complain that it's quite cumbersome and that it takes a long time to get that review done. In this case, there was even a block on the publication of the book at one point because of a dispute between John Bolton and the intelligence community. So I think the system worked. I think the problem here is that John Bolton violated the trust that he had received in exchange for his position and the security clearance that he received by sharing information with family members. I think it is a good reminder of the importance of protecting the nation's secrets when they are shared with you.